Welcome to this final video in this series on the Anbernic RG552, and after testing this handheld for 3 weeks, I'm definitely ready to give a final thoughts and review video. Now, I do want to stress that I only tested games in Android, so this review is just going to cover the Android side of things. As you know, I purchased a black unit for myself, which is the one sitting right here, and I also received a grey unit from Anbernic as a review unit, which I used as a giveaway. Now, we've already done the random draw on a live stream, and if you don't know the winner yet, it was Must Chow, so congratulations to Must Chow. And as you already know, your RG552 is already on the way. With that said, I want to thank Anbernic for sending me a review unit, and as I mentioned before, all of this testing done in these videos are done independently of Anbernic, and all of these opinions in this review are my own. Now, if you like this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, and we have a Discord server, so come along and join us there, and I'll leave a link in the description below. We'll start with the specs. I'm not going to read this, but I did want to give some thoughts on these specs. Obviously, a lot of talk before the handheld was released was the choice of CPU, the Rockchip 3399. It's definitely an older CPU from Q1 2016. Prior to testing, I was happy to give it the benefit of the doubt if it was capable of showing it had enough emulation performance. Having done all the testing now, the gaming performance isn't quite as good as I had hoped, and we'll talk more about that later. But I think this older, less efficient processor also played a part in the design of the rest of the handheld. For one, the processor now needs a fan and heatsink, whereas the PowerKitty X18S with a stronger T618 processor doesn't. It also means it's larger and heavier too, but it's not uncomfortable to play on because the screen is big enough that I don't have to raise the handheld to play it. For the GPU, the performance seems fine. More often than not, it seemed like the CPU was the one running into bottlenecks in emulation, and raising the resolution seemed to have little effect on performance. Although I haven't tested the Linux operating system yet, I really like the idea of a dual operating system device, and this is really one of the biggest advantages of this handheld. We'll talk more about the screen and battery a little bit later. For the wireless connectivity, there is only 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi. I'm not an expert on Wi-Fi, but there's been a fair bit of criticism online about this handheld missing 5 GHz Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. I did test the game streaming a little using the Moonlight streaming app, and it wasn't too bad. There are definitely some stutters here and there, and I have to assume 5 GHz would have made it a lot better. That said, everyone's situation is going to vary wildly, and it might work well for me, but not for you. Bluetooth is a big omission, I feel, and that's because the RG552 comes with mini HDMI out, which would allow the handheld to be used as a console for the TV. Without Bluetooth, I had to use a wired controller, which works fine. I tried to use a Bluetooth controller, but wasn't able to find an option in the settings. The build quality is really good here. I mentioned that the handheld is a little bit bigger and heavier than it could have been, but aside from that, Anbernic made sure that every detail on the exterior had an attention to detail higher than most other retro handhelds. Controls are another matter, and Anbernic have gone for their tried and tested control design from their RG351P series. However, our hands haven't gotten any bigger since, so making the handheld larger presents a few problems. Firstly, I have smaller hands, so this might not be an issue for others. The handheld has the D-pad symmetrical with the face buttons, and I think this was a good choice as most of the games played on this handheld still use the D-pad more than the lower left analog stick. Most of the time, using D-pad and face buttons is really comfortable. It's a little less comfortable using the analog sticks, but having used it in long 2-hour sessions, I think it's still fine. Where it's not comfortable is when my fingers have to reach to press the L2 and R2 buttons and use the analog stick at the same time. Sometimes it also means accidentally pressing the adjacent L1 or R1 buttons too. I hope Anbernic move towards stacked shoulder buttons like the Nintendo Switch. I only played on Android, so I can't really give any thoughts on Linux right now. The RG552 is using Android 7 and it seems a little old. This means that you won't be able to use Ether SX2, the new PS2 emulator, as it requires Android 8, but I strongly doubt you would have enough processing power to run those games well anyways. I also have some concerns with such an old OS. It's possible that emulators may get updated in the future where there may be some incompatibility, and if you don't save those old versions, it may be a little tricky to restore the apps, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. Something I really like is that Anbernic have included ATV Launcher, and it's really their most polished launcher to date. Usually when I get my handheld, I go straight to playing games, and having a really nice launcher meant I didn't have to do any extra work. I've talked about the screen in my first look video, and I don't have too much more to add. The screen here is really good. Here I've got it running against the PowerKitty X18S, and there's no contest as it's far brighter and vibrant than the X18S. Here's where the RG552 surprised me, but not in a good way. I tested the RG552 against the PowerKitty X18S in Wipeout Pulse, and the results were, well, a wipeout. The RG552 with a 6400 mAh battery lasted exactly 2 hours and 30 minutes, while the PowerKitty X18S lasted 6 hours and 25 minutes. Both screens were at full brightness. In other words, the RG552 uses 2560 mAh per hour, and the PowerKitty X18S uses 769 mAh per hour. The X18S is almost 3 times more efficient. I should note that there's a bit of a problem with my unit on the RG552 as it only charges to 94%. There may also be a problem where my battery completely plummets from 40% to 0% in the last half hour. It's possible I have a dud, but either way expect 3 hours, maybe even 3.5 hours at best with PSP gaming. The temperatures for this is pretty comfortable on the hands, and the fan I assume has to be a big help here. It can still get warm when playing a game, but overall I'd say this is probably about average when it comes to handhelds and temperatures. Let's do a final thoughts summary on game performance. For more in-depth analysis, make sure to check out my previous videos where I dedicated a lot of time into testing these games out. For me personally, PSP emulation was the most important system for this handheld, and that's because the RG351P, one of my favorite handhelds, didn't do a great job with PSP, and combined with a much larger widescreen and a similar form factor to the PSP, I felt like this was going to be a perfect match. And the game performance is good enough 80% of the time. The RG552 plays pretty much all of the 30 FPS games like Final Fantasy Crisis Core and Persona 3, but 60 FPS games are a little bit hit and miss. It'll play Virtua Tennis World Tour and Tekken 6 at 60 FPS, but will struggle in others like God of War and Siphon Filter Dark Mirror. I think the PSP performance is still okay, but I think it really missed a chance to be much better. Saturn performance is okay as well. I think it could have been better. There are some games that seem like they should have worked easily, like Marvel Superheroes and Guardian Heroes. 2D games, but they're slow down here. Dreamcast is probably the one that disappointed me the most of the 6 systems I tested. That's because many titles run at 60 FPS and they get really close, but there are too many obvious frame drops. You can still play many of these games, but this really needed another 20 to 30% extra performance for those demanding games. Nintendo 64 plays really well, some games have issues, but these crop up on stronger hardware anyway, so the RG552 is a great system for Nintendo 64. The large 5-inch screen is awesome for DS. The Drastic emulator has a resized screen option, so this makes the RG552 really enjoyable to play DS games on. Until they make a dual screen handheld, this is definitely one of the better consoles to play DS on, and the performance was great for everything I tried. The RG552 simply doesn't play Gamecube very well. Testing the easiest games to emulate on the handheld, I found even those games struggled, so there's really no reason to consider this for Gamecube. Okay, let's talk about the price, and right now the Anbernic RG552 is $226 on the official website, and even before it was released there was a lot of talk about whether this price was too high. And as I've always said, the price is really subjective and varies from person to person, so if you like what you see in this review, by all means go and get it. It is a very good handheld. Now, I can sort of understand why they set that price the way they've set it, because they kind of just want to test the market and see how high they can charge. Now, personally speaking, I think $150 would be a good price for this handheld because it plays a little less games than the X18S and has higher quality components, and I think that would make it a compelling buy. I think $170 would probably be my upper limit here, and I think $200 and $226 is a little bit of an overkill. If you haven't made up your mind on a next-gen handheld, I would advise just waiting a little bit longer until a few other next-gen handhelds are released and reviewed. The PowerKitty X18S has already been released, and you can check out those videos on my channel. Now, the X18S has a little bit better processor, and the RG552 has better components and a screen, so ultimately it depends on what you prefer. There's also the Odin handheld, which will be released really soon, and I'll be reviewing that for the channel. That's got a Snapdragon 845 and will be priced similarly to the RG552. There's also the KTR1, which also has a Snapdragon 845, but we don't know what the price is going to be yet. There's also the GPD XP, which is a little bit different device, and that's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it has some interesting controller options if you like Android games. Overall, the Anbernic RG552 is a good handheld, but not a great handheld, and it has nothing to do with the price. I really like the form factor, and I really like the controls, and I love the screen, and I love playing 8-bit and 16-bit games on the system. It feels like the perfect handheld to play them on. On the other hand, it feels like it's missing a little bit of processing power that would have made PSP and Dreamcast that much better. I think Anbernic should have just chosen a stronger processor, given they were going to price it higher anyway, because ultimately it's just now a good but expensive handheld rather than a great and expensive handheld. That's it for this one and this series of videos on the RG552. Thank you so much for being patient over the last 3 weeks while I did the testing. And if you like the content, leave a like, and also make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so to catch more of my gaming videos. In the next video, we're going to take a look at this handheld inside this little box here. So I will see you guys in the next one.